Keanu Reeves walked into the upscale restaurant on a quiet Tuesday evening. It was one of those places with soft, dim lighting, elegant decor, and a menu so fancy it made you feel like you were stepping into a world of luxury. Keanu wasn't here for a big night out. In fact, he was hoping to go unnoticed. He didn't want the usual fanfare or attention. After all, he was just a person like anyone else, looking for a peaceful meal. The restaurant was busy, but not overly crowded. People were sitting in small groups, talking in hushed tones, and the clinking of silverware could be heard over soft jazz music. The atmosphere was serene, and Keanu liked that. It had been a long week of filming, and he was looking forward to a calm dinner to relax. He was dressed casually, nothing extravagant, just a simple jacket, jeans, and a hat to blend in. He hoped it would be enough to avoid being recognized, but the moment he stepped inside, a few heads turned. Despite his desire to remain unnoticed, some couldn't help but stare. He gave a small smile, but most of the attention faded as people went back to their meals. A young waiter, still fresh-faced and eager, noticed Keanu's entrance. He had only been working at the restaurant for a few weeks, still learning the ropes. Today, he had made a personal goal to impress the customers with his exceptional service. He was determined to stand out and show everyone he had what it took to be one of the best. But this moment would be his test. The waiter didn't recognize Keanu. He was too focused on his mission to shine, his eyes scanning the room for any opportunity to stand out. As he made his way over to Keanu's table, he felt a sense of pride in himself. After all, he was about to serve someone at a table in this prestigious restaurant. But the moment he looked at Keanu's face, he made an assumption. "Here's your menu," the waiter said with a slight, almost smug smile. "I'm sure you're new here. Let me know if you need anything." Keanu gave the waiter a warm but neutral smile, nodding politely. "Thanks," he said softly, not wanting to draw any attention. He sat back in his chair, scanning the menu, trying to focus on the food. It wasn't long before the waiter returned, this time with a bit more confidence. He had a slightly different tone now, more casual, almost as if he was already mentally judging Keanu's choice of dish. The waiter started making comments about Keanu's order, not realizing that he had no idea who he was speaking to. "I don't think you'll be happy with that," the waiter said. "You should really try the special. It's something most people like." Keanu raised an eyebrow, surprised by the suggestion. He knew what he liked, and his choice was well thought out. But he didn't mind the recommendation, and so he simply nodded and said, "I'll stick with what I've chosen, thanks." The waiter didn't stop. He seemed to think he was offering good advice, unaware of his growing mistake. "Well, if you insist," the waiter continued. "You know, a lot of people who come here don't have the best taste in food. It's always good to try new things, especially when you're here." Keanu, still calm and composed, couldn't help but smile slightly. He had heard it all before. He knew the waiter was just trying to show off his knowledge of the restaurant, but Keanu's mind was elsewhere. He wasn't bothered by it. He had dealt with more than enough of this kind of thing in his career. But little did the waiter know, the person he was speaking to wasn't just another customer. Keanu was the owner of the restaurant, a detail that was yet to be revealed. As the waiter walked away, Keanu relaxed in his seat, waiting for the meal to arrive. He smiled to himself, knowing that soon enough, the young waiter's attitude was about to change. The waiter, feeling more confident after his initial approach, went back to the kitchen, thinking he had done a good job. He couldn't shake the feeling that this evening would be his big chance to impress the rest of the staff and the guests. The restaurant had a reputation for being one of the best in the city, and he wanted to make sure he stood out as one of the top servers. He was already imagining the praise he'd receive when he told everyone how he had helped a guest with his recommendations. But what he didn't know was that the person he had just spoken to, the one he had treated with such casual arrogance, was no ordinary guest. Keanu Reeves, the famous actor, was not someone who needed advice on food or how to enjoy a meal. The waiter didn't recognize him, But Keanu was more than just another face in the crowd. He was the man who owned this very restaurant, a decision he had made to invest in a place where he could create a space for people to relax and enjoy great food without the usual noise and distractions. The waiter, however, was too caught up in his own importance to notice any clues. As he returned with the drinks, he didn't think twice about continuing his little commentary. "You know," the waiter started, "I've been working here for a while, and I've got a pretty good sense of what people enjoy. I can tell when someone's order isn't quite right." He handed Keanu his drink with a slight smile, certain that he was providing some valuable service. Keanu, still calm and composed, looked at the waiter but didn't reply immediately. He didn't want to start a confrontation, and at the end of the day, he was there for a peaceful meal. But the waiter's attitude was starting to grate on him. Keanu had always prided himself on being humble and down-to-earth, and he didn't appreciate being treated like a novice by someone who clearly didn't know who he was. The waiter, however, was oblivious. He stood there with his arms crossed, waiting for Keanu to express some kind of gratitude for his help. Instead, Keanu quietly took the drink, his gaze steady. The waiter, still proud of his professional insights, leaned in a little closer and spoke with more certainty. "I'm telling you, if you stick to the specials here, you'll get the real experience," he said. "That's what most of our regulars always go for. You'll see." Keanu, not one to create unnecessary tension, simply smiled politely, choosing not to engage. He didn't want to be rude, but he also didn't want to continue with the waiter's overbearing advice. "I'll trust you," Keanu said softly, his tone neutral. "I'll stick with my choice, though." At this point, the waiter seemed to think he was getting somewhere. He was convinced that Keanu was now accepting his expertise. The waiter left the table again, feeling proud of himself for doing what he thought was a great job. But what he didn't know was that his overconfidence was about to lead him straight into an uncomfortable situation. Keanu was, in fact, not just a customer. He was the owner of the restaurant, and he had been silently observing everything. The waiter walked back to the kitchen, still feeling good about his interactions, completely unaware of the fact that his words were about to come back to haunt him. He was about to learn a lesson that would change how he treated every customer from then on. The waiter moved through the bustling kitchen, feeling a little more confident with each step. He had just finished a round of table service, and everything seemed to be going well. The guests were happy, the orders were on track, and he was sure that tonight was the night he would impress his colleagues. He couldn't stop thinking about how the guest at table 5 had accepted his recommendations without question. He was practically convinced that he had done a great job. But what he didn't know was that the very person he had been speaking to was now watching him. Keanu Reeves had stayed seated at his table, quiet but alert, his eyes following the waiter's every move. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. Keanu wasn't the kind of person who'd make a scene. Instead, he just watched, waiting for the moment when the waiter would realize who he was and what his behavior had cost him. Keanu had been around the world long enough to know how people worked. He knew that arrogance often came from insecurity, and he didn't let the waiter's comments bother him. He had heard much worse over the years. What bothered him, however, was the lack of respect. Keanu believed in treating everyone with kindness, no matter their background or status. He had worked hard to get where he was, but he didn't believe that made him better than anyone else. So he wasn't angry at the waiter, but he did feel sorry for him. It would be a tough lesson, but one that was necessary. As Keanu sat in his seat, sipping his drink, he thought about how the waiter had casually assumed he was just another diner. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him. He had been mistaken for an ordinary person many times, but this felt different. The waiter was clearly eager to prove something, to show that he knew what he was doing, even at the expense of someone else's dignity. It wasn't long before the manager came walking through the restaurant, his eyes scanning the room as usual. When his gaze landed on Keanu, his face immediately froze. He recognized Keanu instantly, the actor who had quietly bought the restaurant some years ago. The manager's eyes widened in realization. He knew that Keanu preferred to stay out of the spotlight, so it wasn't immediately clear to the staff that he was there. The manager's heartbeat quickened, and he hurried to approach the table. "Excuse me, Mr. Reeves," the manager said, bowing slightly as he reached Keanu's table. He wasn't sure whether to apologize or explain things to Keanu first. But before he could say anything else, Keanu smiled gently, as if to reassure him. "It's all right," Keanu said in his calm, measured voice. "I haven't had a chance to talk to him yet." The manager's eyes shifted toward the waiter, who had returned to the kitchen, still unaware of his error. Keanu watched him, knowing that a lesson was about to unfold. The manager stood silently for a moment, uncertain of what to do next. Should he fire the waiter on the spot? Should he immediately apologize to Keanu? But Keanu, with his typical humility, waved off the situation. He didn't need grand gestures. He just needed the waiter to understand. And he would in time. The manager hesitated, glancing back at Keanu with uncertainty, before he finally decided to step away and give Keanu the space he needed. It was clear that Keanu didn't want any special treatment, but the manager still couldn't shake the thought that something had to be done to prevent this from happening again. Keanu, meanwhile, felt no rush. He had plenty of time. He simply waited, and as the seconds ticked by, the moment of realization for the waiter was growing closer. Keanu knew the young man would eventually see the mistake he'd made. The real question was, how would he react? As the minutes passed, the atmosphere in the restaurant remained calm, with the soft hum of conversations and the clinking of glasses filling the air. Keanu sat quietly at his table, enjoying the peaceful ambience, but his mind was focused on what would happen next. He wasn't angry with the waiter. He wasn't even upset, but he knew the situation was about to shift in a way that would change the waiter's perspective forever. The manager walked away, but he wasn't about to forget the mistake that had just occurred. He had learned from experience that treating every guest with respect, no matter who they were, was vital. He had been in the industry for a long time and had seen countless people with big egos, but nothing prepared him for this moment. His heart raced as he approached the waiter in the kitchen. He could already tell that the young man was still walking with the kind of overconfidence that came from not realizing the seriousness of his actions. "Hey, can I talk to you for a second?" the manager said, his tone much more serious than usual. The waiter, surprised by the sudden shift, stopped what he was doing and looked at the manager. "Yeah, sure. What's up?" the waiter asked, thinking it was just another routine matter. The manager motioned for him to step aside, and they walked a few feet away from the other staff members, out of earshot. The waiter was still oblivious to the weight of what had just happened. "You know that table you were just at?" the manager asked, lowering his voice. The waiter nodded, thinking that maybe the manager was about to commend him for his effort. "That's Keanu Reeves. He owns this place," the manager said, his words clear but calm. The waiter blinked, his mind trying to process the information. He looked at the manager, searching for any hint that this might be some kind of joke. "What?" he said, unable to believe what he was hearing. "I'm serious," the manager replied, his voice quiet but firm. "He's the owner. He's been visiting for a while now, but no one knows when he comes in. He likes to blend in like a regular guest, and from what I can tell, you were treating him like just another person in here for dinner." The waiter's face turned pale as the realization hit him. He hadn't just been giving advice to an ordinary customer. He had been arrogantly dismissing the very man who owned the restaurant, the one who made all of this possible. The waiter opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. "Oh my God," he muttered under his breath. I had no idea." The manager nodded slowly, watching the waiter's face change from confusion to embarrassment. He could see that the young man was beginning to understand just how big a mistake he had made. The manager felt bad for the waiter. He wasn't trying to make him feel worse, but the truth needed to be faced. "You're lucky he's not upset," the manager said, his voice still calm. "But I need you to understand that this is a lesson in humility. You can't treat any guest like that, no matter who they are or how they appear. Everyone deserves respect, especially in a place like this." The waiter nodded, his face now flushed with shame. He had never felt more embarrassed in his life. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice filled with regret. "I had no idea." The manager gave him a firm look, not to scold him, but to drive the lesson home. It's not about the mistake. It's about how you learn from it. Go over to his table, apologize, and make sure he knows you respect him. You might not say anything, but that's the right thing to do." The waiter swallowed hard and nodded, feeling like his world had just flipped upside down. He had come into work thinking he was going to show off his skills, but now he was faced with the humbling truth that he had overstepped without even knowing it. He knew what he had to do next, and it wasn't going to be easy. With his heart pounding in his chest, the waiter slowly turned and walked back toward Keanu's table, the weight of his actions heavy on his shoulders. He had no idea how Keanu would react, but he was determined to do what was right. The waiter's legs felt heavy as he walked back toward Keanu's table. His mind raced with thoughts of what to say. How could he apologize for something so careless? He had been so eager to show off his knowledge and impress everyone, but now he realized that his arrogance had overshadowed everything. The weight of his mistakes settled on him more with every step, and he wished he could turn back time. As he approached Keanu's table, he felt his palms sweat. Keanu was sitting quietly, as composed as ever, sipping his drink, his gaze soft and calm. The waiter paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. Keanu hadn't reacted harshly yet, but that didn't mean the mistake hadn't been noticed. The waiter swallowed hard, knowing he had to face the consequences of his actions. "Mr. Reeves," the waiter said, his voice a little shaky. I need to apologize. I didn't realize who you were earlier, and I want to sincerely apologize for my behavior. I shouldn't have treated you the way I did. It was unprofessional, and I'm truly sorry." Keanu looked up from his drink, meeting the waiter's gaze. There was no anger or disappointment in Keanu's eyes, just calmness. For a moment, the waiter wasn't sure how to read the expression on Keanu's face. Would he be upset? Would he demand some kind of compensation for the disrespect? But Keanu simply smiled, a small, understanding smile. "It's okay," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You didn't know, and I understand that. But it's important to remember that every person deserves respect, no matter who they are. What matters is that you've realized what happened, and that's the first step." The waiter's heart lifted a little at Keanu's words, though he still felt the sting of his actions. "I was so focused on trying to prove myself, I lost sight of what's really important," the waiter admitted. "I didn't mean to be disrespectful, but I can see how my attitude came across that way. I've learned a valuable lesson tonight." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "It's not always easy to realize when we're making a mistake, but as long as we learn from it, we're all better for it." He paused, taking a small sip of his drink before adding, "I don't expect special treatment, but I do expect honesty and kindness. That goes a long way, even in places like this." The waiter's embarrassment began to ease as Keanu spoke. There was no judgment in his voice, no harsh words. Keanu wasn't angry or upset. He was just offering a kind, encouraging reminder. It felt like a weight was being lifted from the waiter's shoulders. He hadn't expected Keanu to be so understanding. In fact, he had braced himself for much worse. "I'll do my best to remember that," the waiter said, feeling a little lighter. "I really appreciate your understanding. Thank you for not making this more difficult than it already is." Keanu smiled again, the warmth in his expression making the waiter feel even more at ease. "We all make mistakes. It's how we handle them that counts." The waiter took another deep breath, realizing that this moment had changed him. It wasn't just about apologizing to Keanu. It was about learning to treat every person with respect, no matter who they were or what they did for a living. The waiter knew he had learned something far more valuable than any advice he could have given on the menu. As Keanu turned his attention back to his meal, the waiter gave a quick nod and walked away, his mind already processing the lesson he had just learned. It wasn't just about doing his job well. It was about being a better person, one who understood that kindness and humility mattered most. He had the chance to start fresh, and that was a gift he wouldn't take for granted. The waiter walked back into the kitchen with a mix of relief and lingering embarrassment. He had done what he needed to do. He had apologized, and it had gone better than he had expected. Still, he couldn't shake the weight of the realization that his earlier behavior had been so careless. He couldn't stop replaying the moment in his mind, when he had spoken without thinking and assumed too much. But now that the interaction with Keanu had ended on a positive note, he began to feel a little more at ease. As he entered the kitchen, the other staff members were busy with their tasks, but the waiter could see a few curious glances sent his way. They must have noticed his conversation with the manager earlier. Some of them were probably wondering what had happened. The waiter tried to shake off the nerves as he moved to wash his hands, but he couldn't help feeling like everyone was watching him. The manager, who had been keeping an eye on everything, approached him as soon as he saw him. He didn't need to say much. The look in the waiter's eyes told him everything. The waiter had already learned the lesson the hard way. "You handled that well," the manager said quietly, his tone approving. "I know it wasn't easy, but you did the right thing." The waiter nodded, still feeling a bit shaken but grateful for the support. "Thanks. I really didn't know what to expect. I thought it was going to be much worse." The manager smiled, his eyes softening. "It's not about what you expected. It's about the fact that you took responsibility for your actions and fixed it. That's what matters." The waiter felt a little pride stir within him. It wasn't often that people acknowledged when you made a mistake and took the time to correct it. It felt good to hear something positive after such an awkward situation. He knew that he had learned something valuable tonight, and it wasn't just about being a better waiter. It was about being a better person. Someone who could admit when he was wrong and make things right, no matter how difficult it was. As the night went on, the restaurant's atmosphere seemed to return to normal. The clink of glasses, the hum of quiet conversations, and the soft rhythm of the kitchen made everything feel like it was back to the way it should be. But the waiter could not shake the feeling that something inside him had changed. He was more mindful now, more aware of how he interacted with others. He was no longer the overconfident young man trying to impress everyone. He was someone who had learned the hard way that treating people with respect wasn't just about following rules. It was about recognizing their worth, no matter who they were. The night was coming to an end, and the waiter finished his shift, cleaning up his section with a newfound sense of humility. He thought about Keanu, how calm and understanding he had been. It was a reminder that kindness could go a long way, even in a world that sometimes seemed to value status and appearances over everything else. The waiter had a lot to think about as he walked out the back door and into the cool night air. He realized that even though it had been a challenging night, it had also been one of the most important moments in his life. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone. What mattered was how he treated people and how he carried himself in the world. And that was something he would carry with him every day from now on. The next morning, the waiter woke up feeling a little different. It wasn't just the usual morning grogginess or the rush to get ready for work. This time, he felt a sense of clarity, as though something inside him had clicked into place. The events of the previous evening were still fresh in his mind. He had learned a valuable lesson, one that wasn't about serving food or memorizing the menu, but about how to treat people, how to truly respect them, regardless of who they were or what they did. It was a lesson that had hit him harder than he expected, but it had also made him better. As he got ready for his shift, he thought about Keanu again. He didn't expect to see him back at the restaurant anytime soon, but the conversation they had the night before had stuck with him. Keanu had been so calm and gracious, and that was something he had never forgotten. Most people might have gotten angry or worse, embarrassed the waiter in front of the entire restaurant. But Keanu had been different. He'd been understanding and humble, and that made the waiter realize how important it was to be kind and humble, especially when dealing with people who didn't expect it. When he walked into the restaurant, the usual rush of activity hit him. The buzz of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the hum of the kitchen were all around him. But this time, instead of feeling like a small part of a machine, the waiter felt like he was part of something much bigger. He knew he had a role to play, but now he understood that his actions could make a bigger impact than he had ever imagined. The manager noticed the change in him immediately. "Hey, how are you feeling today?" the manager asked, raising an eyebrow as he saw the waiter's quieter, more focused demeanor. "I'm good," the waiter replied, offering a small smile. "I've been thinking a lot about last night, about what you said, about treating people with respect." He paused for a moment, reflecting on the previous evening. "I think I've learned a lot from it. I won't forget it." The manager's eyes softened, and he nodded in approval. "That's good to hear. We all make mistakes. What matters is how we learn from them." The waiter had learned that lesson, and he was ready to put it into practice. He went about his work with a new sense of purpose. He approached each customer with kindness, no longer eager to impress, but focused on providing the best experience possible. He made sure to listen to each guest, to treat them with care, and to always be respectful, even if they didn't ask for it. As the day wore on, the waiter found himself smiling more. He realized that he was no longer just going through the motions of his job. He was truly engaging with the people around him, making an effort to make their day a little better. It felt good. It felt right. By the end of his shift, the waiter was exhausted but satisfied. He knew that, despite the early mistake, he had turned things around. The lesson he had learned wasn't just about how to be a better waiter. It was about how to be a better person. And he was grateful for that, even if it had taken a bit of an awkward and humbling experience to get there. As he headed home, the waiter thought about how far he had come in such a short time. His attitude had shifted. His perspective had changed. He wasn't the same person he had been the night before. And that, he realized, was the most important thing of all. The weeks that followed felt like a new chapter for the waiter. Every shift seemed to bring fresh opportunities for him to apply what he had learned. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was truly present in his work. The arrogance that had once clouded his interactions with customers was replaced with humility and a genuine desire to connect. Every guest, no matter who they were, now received the respect they deserved. Keanu's words had stayed with him. "It's how we handle our mistakes that counts." That simple phrase echoed in his mind every day. It wasn't just about doing a job well. It was about how he treated people, how he responded to the world around him. He had been given a chance to correct his error, and he took it to heart. The shift in his attitude wasn't just noticed by the manager or his coworkers, but by the guests as well. One evening, as he served a family at a table near the window, he overheard a conversation. The family was discussing a recent visit to another high-end restaurant, and the waiter could hear them mention how the service had been lacking, how the staff had seemed disinterested. The waiter couldn't help but feel proud of the difference he was making now. He had come to realize that providing good service wasn't about delivering the food. It was about delivering the experience. The guests weren't just coming for the meal. They were coming for the entire atmosphere, the feeling of being treated with care and attention. That night, as he made his rounds, he noticed a familiar face seated at the corner table. It was Keanu. The waiter's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen him since that evening when everything had changed. He couldn't help but feel a little nervous as he approached the table. He hoped that Keanu would notice the difference in him, that he would see the transformation the waiter had undergone. Keanu looked up and smiled as the waiter arrived at his table, and for the first time, the waiter didn't feel nervous. He felt confident in his own skin, knowing that he had earned the right to be there, standing in front of him as a better person than before. "Good evening, Mr. Reeves," the waiter said, his voice steady and polite. "Good evening," Keanu replied, his smile warm as always. "How's everything going?" The waiter paused for a moment, feeling a genuine sense of gratitude. "It's going great," he said, his voice sincere. "I've learned a lot since the last time we spoke, and I just wanted to say thank you for being understanding. It really helped me turn things around." Keanu's smile grew. "I'm glad to hear that," he said. "I can see that you've really taken the lesson to heart." The waiter felt a sense of relief wash over him. There was no judgment in Keanu's words, only encouragement. The interaction felt different this time. There was no awkwardness, no tension, just a simple acknowledgement of how much he had grown. As he left Keanu to enjoy his meal, the waiter couldn't help but reflect on the journey he had been through. It wasn't just about learning to apologize or how to serve food. It was about learning to be humble, to treat others with respect, and to grow from his mistakes. The waiter had learned that the most important thing wasn't the mistakes he made, but how he handled them, and what he learned from them. By the time his shift ended, the waiter felt like he had truly grown. He had learned more than just how to interact with customers. He had learned how to be a better person. And that lesson, more than anything, was the one he would carry with him forever. He left the restaurant that night with a sense of pride, not just in the work he had done, but in the person he had become.